Chapter 1: The Forsaken Altar. The solemn tolling of the ancient bell tower at Chapel St. Jude rang in slow, measured beats, its melancholy echoes dissolving into the late afternoon air of the London season. To Eleanor Vance, the knell sounded like a dirge for her own departed honor. She stood erect before the altar, ablaze with the flicker of candlelight, in a white satin bridal gown yellowed to ivory, the sole precious relic of her late mother clinging to her slender, slightly trembling shoulders. Eleanor clenched her hands, her knuckles whitening, as her fingers pressed against the coarse fabric of the small pocket at her hip, where she had carefully tucked away her mother's locked, intricately carved wooden box. That wooden casket was the only thread linking her to the mother she had lost, and the only item she had brought from the freezing attic room of Vance Manor. The chapel was bathed in a cold, dim light filtering through the stained glass windows depicting St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Specks of dust danced lazily in the pale beams, a stark contrast to the hollow splendor of the London ton gathered in the pews. Eleanor recalled the previous night, standing in her father's shadowed study. Baron Vance, her weak-willed, silver-haired father, had hung his head, unable to meet her gaze. He had stammered a confession, her entire dowry of £10,000. The sum her mother had painstakingly secured before her passing had been squandered at the gaming tables of St. James. To settle his debts of honor, her stepmother Lady Vance stood beside him with a cold sneer, declaring that the family had not a single farthing to waste on a useless eldest daughter. Eleanor had raised no voice in protest. She had simply turned and walked away in silence, steeling herself to fulfill her final obligation. Ever since her mother's passing, her father had swiftly remarried a cunning, conniving woman. Eleanor was immediately stripped of her privileges as a lady, banished to the drafty attic to live like a servant, and burdened with the management of the estate's ledger, while her father drowned himself in gambling. She worked day and night, pinching every penny for the estate, while her father and stepmother squandered fortunes on high society balls. Under the dim candlelight of each evening, she cross-referenced the ledgers, helplessly watching the slow ruin of her family. The worn, yellowed satin gown she wore today was testament to that decay, yet Eleanor would rather wear it than the cheap, coarse gown her stepmother had prepared, preserving the last remnant of her mother's dignity. Beside her, Viscount Thomas Thorne stood tall, yet he did not deign to cast a single glance in her direction. His gaze was fixed on the front pew, where Clara Vance, Eleanor's stepsister, sat. Clara was attired in a fashionable pink silk lace gown commissioned from Paris, blooming like a spring rose in the heart of London. Clara's eyes gleamed with triumph as she watched her sister standing solitary before the altar. It was no secret that Clara had employed her wiles to ensnare Thomas, and Thomas, a shallow, covetous man, had fallen easily into her trap. He gazed at Clara with undisguised adoration, utterly ignoring his betrothed. Throughout their 2-year betrothal, Thomas had never once inquired after the hardships she endured at Vance Manor. He had only regarded her with calculating eyes, measuring her family's declining fortunes. He had agreed to marry her solely for her £10,000 dowry, desperate to salvage the failing investments of the Thorne family. Now, with that sum dissolved by her father's gambling, Thomas had no reason left to proceed with this union. "I refuse," Thomas's cold, resolute voice rang out, cutting cleanly through the soft murmurs of the assembly. The organist's hands abruptly froze on the keys, producing a jarring, discordant note before falling dead silent. Chapel St. Jude was plunged into a suffocating, breathless silence. Shocked gasps erupted from the pews of the haughty guests. They stared with wide, hungry eyes, eagerly anticipating a theatrical scandal. Ladies raised their plumed fans to conceal their mouths, but their eyes gleamed with delight at the spectacle unfolding before them. The elderly curate looked up over his spectacles, his voice bewildered and trembling. "My Lord Thomas, are you quite certain? This sacred ceremony prepared before God..." Thomas Thorne did not even deign to look at the curate. Instead, he pointed an accusing finger at Eleanor. "I am entirely certain. This ceremony was a mistake from the start. I cannot wed someone who brings no advantage to the house of Thorne. A lady without a dowry is a financial burden I refuse to bear. I cannot accept a wife who does nothing to advance the prospects of my family." He turned to face Eleanor, his eyes sweeping over her with cold contempt. "A man marries to gain a lady to grace his drawing room, not a servant dressed in finery to pinch pennies for her family. I cannot shore up a bankrupt house. The London ton would mock me mercilessly were I to bring a penniless bride into Thorne Manor." Murmurs erupted like wildfire among the aristocracy behind them. They whispered eagerly about the destitution of the Vance family and the shocking revelation that Eleanor possessed no dowry. Eleanor's stepmother daintily pressed a lace handkerchief to her face in a display of mock distress, while Baron Vance could only hang his head in silent shame, avoiding the judging glares of his peers, abandoning his eldest daughter to be publicly humiliated. "Oh, what a pity for poor Eleanor," Clara murmured to the young ladies beside her, her voice sweet as honey but laced with venom. "But Thomas is quite right. How could she possibly uphold the Thorne reputation without a single penny to her name? His choice is entirely sensible." Eleanor did not weep. She stood tall before the 100 prying, disdainful eyes of the London ton. There were no desperate pleas, no weak tears that her stepmother and Clara so eagerly anticipated to mock. She looked Thomas dead in the eye, her gaze an icy, steady gray. In that moment, Eleanor felt no humiliation. Instead, an immense wave of relief washed over her. She saw with perfect clarity the mercenary, hollow stature of the self-proclaimed nobility surrounding her. She slowly raised her left hand, her slender fingers deliberately slipping off the cheap silver betrothal ring Thomas had given her 2 years prior, before the Vance fortunes had completely crumbled. The silver band fell to the chapel's marble floor with a sharp click, rolling a few times before coming to rest against the toe of Thomas's polished leather boot. "The honor of the Vance family has never resided in my dowry, Viscount," Eleanor said, her voice clear, resolute, and without a single tremor. "And my own honor certainly does not depend on the promise of a coward who breaks his word out of mere greed. You believe you are casting me aside, but in truth I am being delivered from a base coward." She turned to look directly at her father, whose head remained bowed, her voice carrying a deep disappointment but also absolute finality. "Father, I have fulfilled my duty as a daughter of the House of Vance. From this moment forth, I owe you, and this estate, absolutely nothing." She dipped into a curtsy, strictly adhering to noble etiquette, and turned to depart. Eleanor walked with firm, steady steps down the red-carpeted aisle of the chapel, her slender back held perfectly straight beneath her outdated wedding gown. Passing the pews of whispering gossips, she clutched the pocket containing her mother's wooden box. She knew that from this moment on, the ton would deem her a socially ruined woman, a forsaken bride. Yet she would far rather have her freedom in poverty than be bound to a man as base as Thomas. She stepped out into the afternoon light of London, ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. Chap 2. The Duke steps forward, the swell of the violins and the heavy notes of the organ within St. Jude's Chapel died away, yielding to a suffocating silence. Eleanor Vance trod the crimson carpet of the nave, her spine as unyielding as a slender willow defying a winter gale. She resolutely ignored the flutter of feathered fans, raised to mask the cruel sneers of the ton. She felt the burning, critical stares fixed upon her outdated satin wedding gown, its hem slightly frayed, a relic of her late mother, from happier days before the House of Vance fell to ruin. Beneath the folds of her gown, Eleanor's hand closed tightly around a small wooden box. It was her sole treasure, holding her mother's handwritten letters and a few keepsake trinkets, the only things she had taken when she fled the cold attic room of Vance Manor. Each step she took was a quiet declaration of war against the humiliation her former betrothed, Viscount Thomas Thorne, had just visited upon her. Thomas, who had loudly dissolved the engagement because the Vance family possessed no dowry, stood with arms crossed beside Clara, Eleanor's stepsister. Clara inclined her head slightly against Thomas's shoulder, the fashionable pink lace of her gown seeming to mock Eleanor's solitary state. Yet Eleanor held her chin high with pride, her cool ash-gray eyes fixed forward on the heavy oak doors, where the fading light of dusk was swallowed by the London fog. Just as Eleanor reached the marble threshold, the dim light was suddenly blocked. A tall, imposing figure blocked her path. Behind her, the gathering of the ton fell instantly silent. The whispers died away, replaced by sharp, fearful gasps of astonishment. The air within the chapel seemed to freeze with the sudden appearance of this man. It was Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Ravenwood. The Duke stood there, looming like a fortress of dark stone. Arthur possessed an exceptionally tall and commanding frame, his broad shoulders enveloped in a flawlessly tailored coat of black wool. His very presence radiated a suffocating, oppressive authority. One side of his face retained sharp, chiseled features as if carved from marble, while the other bore a long scar running from temple to cheek, a brutal remnant of Waterloo. That scar only served to heighten the ruthless, cold demeanor of the man known as the most terrifying man in England. Arthur was not only a decorated war hero, but also a merciless autocrat of the exchange, seizing the estates of ruined families without a shred of pity. His icy blue eyes swept over Eleanor. She did not avert her gaze from his scarred face as other young ladies did in terror. Instead, she met his gaze directly, with the pride of a soul trampled yet unbroken. A flicker of surprise flashed in Arthur's eyes, before he swept past her and strode into the nave. The steady click of Arthur's leather boots echoed sharply on the stone floor, breaking the silence of the chapel. The members of the ton parted like the Red Sea before him, dipping into curtsies and bowing in respectful, fearful silence. Viscount Thomas Thorne tried to salvage his composure, stepping forward to speak, "Your Grace," but Arthur ignored him entirely. He swept past him as if the Viscount were mere air, halting before Baron Vance, the weak-willed father who stood trembling beside Lady Vance. "Baron Vance," Arthur spoke, his voice deep, yet as cold as a Yorkshire winter frost. It was not loud, yet it was enough to make the Baron's knees buckle. "Today is the 3rd of July, the deadline for the £20,000 debt you secured against Vance Manor. I trust my solicitor delivered the notice to you a month ago." Baron Vance's color drained instantly. "Your Grace, I have purchased this debt from the National Bank over the last 3 months," Arthur interrupted coldly. "Ravenwood does not make a habit of granting extensions to those who cannot pay. If you cannot produce the full £20,000 today, I shall sign the foreclosure order for Vance Manor immediately. Your entire family must vacate the premises before sunset tomorrow." "Oh, merciful Duke." Lady Vance rushed forward, her heavily powdered face cracking with panic as she forced a pleading smile. "Pray, show us some leniency. My second daughter Clara is to be wed to Viscount Thomas Thorne here. The wealthy Thorne family will surely assist us in settling this debt. We beg of your Grace, grant us but 1 month more." Arthur Pendleton's lips curled in sheer disdain. He glanced at the cheap silver band still lying forgotten on the stone floor, the ring Eleanor had flung back at Thomas. "From what I have just witnessed, Viscount Thomas has only just dissolved his betrothal to your eldest daughter here at the altar. Can a man who breaks his vows before God for want of a dowry be trusted to guarantee a debt of £20,000? Thomas Thorne turned a violent shade of red with humiliation. "Your Grace, that is a private family matter. I broke the engagement because she has no dowry. And it is my right to seize the property of bankrupt debtors," Arthur replied with freezing calm. Silencing Thomas instantly, he turned back to Baron Vance. "I do not accept promises from oath-breakers. The Thorne family itself is drowning in debt. What standing have they to offer a guarantee? Baron Vance, do you possess the coin here today?" Baron Vance lowered his head in utter defeat. He had squandered every last shilling of Eleanor's dowry at the gaming tables, and now the House of Vance was completely ruined. His silence was answer enough. Whispers rippled through the gathered members of the ton, regarding the downfall of the Vance family. Clara Vance clutched her pink lace fan, her beautiful eyes wide with terror, as she realized their life of luxury was vanishing into thin air. Amidst the suffocating tension, Arthur Pendleton turned abruptly. He paced slowly toward Eleanor, who still stood silent by the chapel doors. The Duke's cold blue eyes swept over her slender shoulders. He noted the slight tremor of her frame from the chill, yet her gaze remained proud and unbroken. She was like a delicate rose blooming amidst ashes, maintaining her dignity though surrounded by betrayal and scorn. A strange sensation, a deep, begrudging respect, stirred in the chest of the notoriously heartless Duke. Arthur reached up to unfasten the silver clasp of the heavy black wool cloak draped over his shoulders. The massive garment carried the noble scents of cedarwood, incense, and fine leather. To the utter astonishment of the onlookers, Arthur placed the cloak over Eleanor's slender shoulders, enveloping her in his warmth and absolute power. Then the Duke bowed to her, a gesture executed with the most meticulous and formal etiquette. Meeting her eyes directly, his deep voice resonated throughout the chapel. "Marry me instead." Then, the proposal struck St. Jude's Chapel like a bolt of lightning. The entire church fell into a stunned silence. Feathered fans slipped from limp fingers and clattered onto the stone floor. Thomas Thorne stood agape in sheer disbelief. Clara let out a sharp, strangled cry of envy and resentment. A young woman cast aside moments ago for her poverty was now, in the space of a breath, offered the hand of the most powerful peer in England. It was a staggering elevation, and a resounding slap to the faces of those who had sought to humiliate her. Eleanor looked deep into Arthur's eyes. She was well aware of the dark, sinister rumors surrounding the desolate Ravenwood estate in Yorkshire. She knew this marriage would be devoid of affection, a mere transaction to clear her father's debt and salvage her own ruined standing. Yet, as she cast a glance back at her pale, horrified stepmother, her envious sister, and her disgraced former betrothed, she knew this man was the only shield that could protect her from the gathering storm. Eleanor offered a proud, elegant smile, placing her small hand into the broad, calloused palm of the Duke. She spoke, "I accept your grace." Arthur lightly squeezed her fingers, an unspoken vow of absolute protection. He turned his attention to the elderly curate. "I trust you can perform the ceremony immediately?" "My lord, it requires a special license," the clergyman stammered. Arthur produced a folded parchment bearing a vivid red ducal and royal seal. "A special license from the Archbishop of Canterbury. I am always prepared for my transactions." Before the horrified gazes of the Vance family and the London Ton, Eleanor stepped back toward the altar, this time beside Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Ravenwood. No longer a discarded bride, she was now the future Duchess of Ravenwood, stepping into a tempestuous new life, yet holding her head high with unyielding pride. Chapter 3. The Marriage Settlement. A thick early-morning London fog shrouded every corner of Chancery Lane, swallowing the gas lamps that had yet to be extinguished. Behind the misted window panes of Harrison and Associates, solicitors, the chambers offered a quiet, warm sanctuary, redolent of crimson sealing wax, aged parchment, and the gentle crackle of a coal hearth. Here, the grand arrangements of the Ton were settled in black ink upon white paper, and family fortunes were weighed in cold, legal calculations. Mr. Harrison, the Pendleton family's loyal solicitor, solemnly placed the marriage settlement upon the large oak table. Arthur Pendleton sat in the armchair opposite Eleanor, clad in a dark cashmere waistcoat, his posture bearing the commanding presence of a battlefield general. The light from the window highlighted the long scar running from his temple down to his cheek, a brutal remnant of the Battle of Waterloo. His icy blue eyes silently observed Eleanor, scrutinizing the young lady who had just endured a humiliating broken engagement only the day before. Eleanor Vance sat opposite him, her back straight and proud in a simple dark green woolen gown with slightly frayed cuffs. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly back, revealing a countenance of extraordinary composure. There were no tears nor any trace of shame. The resolve in her ash-gray eyes left even Mr. Harrison silently astonished. "Your Grace, Miss Vance," the solicitor cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "As instructed, I have drafted this settlement. Your father's debt of £20,000 will be fully discharged by the Ravenwood estate immediately upon signing. Vance Manor will remain in your father's possession, but financial oversight and revenues will be transferred to our office to manage, to prevent him from further gambling." Arthur nodded, his deep, cold voice ringing out. "I am investing in this marriage, not your father's gambling habit. £20,000 is no small sum, and I wish to ensure that estate will not be brought to ruin once more." Mr. Harrison pushed the settlement and the inked quill toward Eleanor. She did not rush to sign, however, but turned each page to review it thoroughly. Her 5 years of experience managing her family's estate ledgers allowed her to quickly identify the complex clauses regarding inheritance and mutual obligations. On the third page, she paused at the line detailing the pin money. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, "the allowance of £500 a year for pin money is most generous. However, I wish for it to be deposited directly into my own account at Coutts & Co. And I must have sole, independent authority over its use without requiring approval from your house steward. I desire absolute financial independence." Arthur raised an eyebrow, a flicker of approval passing through his sharp blue eyes. The nobility generally regarded women as caring only for fashion and idle gossip. Eleanor's familiarity with banking and her sharp negotiation skills were qualities he had never before encountered in any lady. "Your request is entirely reasonable," Arthur murmured, the corner of his mouth curving slightly in amusement. "I shall not interfere with your private expenditures." "Mr. Harrison, see that this amendment is made." Eleanor turned the page, stopping at the section on domestic management. "I wish to clarify, does the authority to manage the household of Ravenwood Manor include hiring and firing staff, changing suppliers, and adjusting the servants' wages?" Arthur looked directly at her. "The estate has been in disarray since my sister-in-law passed away. If you have the capability to keep Vance Manor from collapsing, I am willing to grant you full authority over domestic expenditures. I care only for the result, an orderly manner and no waste." "Very well, I have no further questions," Eleanor said. She put the pen to paper and signed her name, Eleanor Vance, in a slender but remarkably resolute script. Arthur took the pen and signed his name beside hers. Eleanor felt a strange sensation ripple through her chest. From this day forward she was bound to the most feared man in England, yet she did so in the position of an independent negotiator, maintaining her dignity through her own practical competence. The formalities complete, Arthur stood up and offered his hand to assist her. "Welcome to the Pendleton family, my lady. The carriage is ready outside. We shall depart for Yorkshire immediately. It is far colder there than in London. I hope you are prepared for it." "I am accustomed to cold winters, your grace. I do not fear hardship," she murmured, placing her hand within his broad palm. The carriage bearing the silver wolf's head crest of the Pendleton family departed London, leaving behind the malicious gossip and the clamor of the city. The journey to the far north was a completely novel experience for Eleanor. Outside the carriage window, the scenery shifted constantly. The city gave way to the lush green fields of the Midlands, then to the rugged stone hills of Derbyshire, before they finally entered the wild Yorkshire countryside. The further north they traveled, the harsher the weather became. The wind howled against the glass, carrying a bone-chilling cold and a gray drizzle that stained the earth and sky. The desolate, solitary expanse of the endless, heather-covered moors could easily weigh upon one's spirits with a heavy sense of isolation. Sitting opposite Arthur in the confined space, Eleanor pulled her thin woolen cloak tighter. Though she strove not to appear weak in front of her new husband, her shoulders still trembled slightly from the bone-chilling cold. Arthur opened his eyes, taking in her trembling shoulders and pale lips. Without a word of sentiment, he pulled a thick, fur-lined woolen blanket and draped it over her shoulders and lap. When the carriage stopped at a coaching inn to change horses, Arthur alighted, returning a short while later with a tray of steaming hot food. "Eat," he said, placing the tray of beef stew and buttered toast onto the small table between the seats. "You must keep warm to avoid falling ill. I have no desire for an ailing wife confined to her bed in this remote country." Despite his cold words, Eleanor could perceive the quiet consideration hidden beneath them. She held the warm bowl of soup, the heat radiating through her palms and helping her body recover quickly, easing the tension between them. "Thank you, your grace," Eleanor murmured softly. Arthur looked at her. "At Ravenwood, there is no room for weakness or empty social pleasantries. Practicality is the only thing that ensures survival." She nodded, then inquired to break the silence. "Your grace, Mr. Harrison mentioned that I would be assisting with the care of your nephew. Could you tell me more about the boy?" Arthur gazed thoughtfully out the rain-misted window, his usual cold demeanor softening slightly. "His name is Leo," Arthur said in a low voice. "He is 6 years old, the only son of my late brother. A year ago, a horrific carriage accident on an icy mountain pass in Yorkshire claimed his parents' lives. Leo was the sole survivor, having witnessed the entire dreadful tragedy." Arthur paused to master his emotions. Since that night, Leo has shut himself away completely. He speaks to no one, starts at loud noises, and refuses any contact with the outside world. The physicians are all helpless in the face of this invisible wound. The boy only hides in the darkest corners of the manor. Eleanor listened, her heart aching with compassion. Having lost her mother at a young age, she understood all too well the hollow isolation of losing one's greatest support. Leo's silence was but the fragile shield of a wounded child. "He needs love and patience more than medicine," Eleanor said gently. "I will not force Leo to speak immediately, but will let him determine his own comfortable distance. The vital thing is to help him understand that Ravenwood is a sanctuary." Arthur looked at her. In the dim light of the carriage as it rushed through the storm, he saw in Eleanor an extraordinary combination of gentleness and fortitude. His respect for her deepened. Perhaps this woman was indeed the missing piece that the cold house of Ravenwood so desperately needed. "I hope you will prove true to your words," Arthur said, his deep voice carrying a quiet note of trust. "Welcome to Ravenwood, Eleanor." Chapter 4: The Cold Manor. The steady crunch of carriage wheels upon the Yorkshire cobblestones resonated in a monotonous drone. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the glass, watching the bleak landscape drift past in a shroud of mist. Fertile Hampshire had long receded, yielding to the barren, windswept heather moors. The northern gale howled through the valley, whipping up the season's first snowflakes beneath a heavy, leaden sky. It was cold, desolate, like a world forgotten by time. Arthur had traveled alongside Eleanor for the long journey from London, sharing stories of the windswept Yorkshire moors. However, just as the carriage crossed the borders of the Ravenwood estate, a rider dispatched from the capital arrived with an urgent message. Arthur was forced to transfer to a swift mount and return to London immediately to handle the pressing debt paperwork of the Vance family, and attend a critical court hearing regarding their assets. He was obliged to leave Eleanor to complete the final leg of the journey to the manor alone, promising to join her at the earliest possible moment. Rounding a narrow bend, Ravenwood Manor emerged atop the hill, looming like a slumbering beast. The moss-draped gray-stone estate rose with sharp turrets piercing the sky, its narrow windows staring out like soulless eyes. Bereft of any welcoming blooms, Ravenwood stood cold and forbidding, a reflection of its master, the Duke of Ravenwood. The carriage came to a halt before the stone steps. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing rows of servants standing rigid under the dim candlelight along the grand corridor. Yet this reception was utterly devoid of the warmth, however slight, due to the new mistress of the manor. At the head of the servants stood Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a tall and austere figure in stiff black silk, her gray hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her face was as cold as carved stone, her sharp eyes piercing Eleanor as she stepped down from the carriage. "Welcome to Ravenwood, Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Gable said in a flat, monotonous tone, without dipping into the customary curtsy. The greeting was a mere formality, a thinly veiled display of disdain. "His Grace is not presently at the estate, having been called away on urgent matters in London. I have been instructed to arrange your lodgings." Behind the housekeeper, the housemaids whispered among themselves, scanning her worn travel attire. To them, a girl from a ruined baron's family, entering this manor as a settlement for her father's debts, was unworthy of the respect due to the Duchess. In their eyes, she was nothing more than a debted bride. Eleanor's chest tightened at the cold hostility, yet she drew a deep breath, raising her chin and squaring her shoulders. She looked directly into Mrs. Gable's eyes, her emerald eyes flashing with a quiet, resolute calm. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "I regret His Grace's absence, but I trust we shall have ample time to become acquainted. Pray, show me to my chambers." Mrs. Gable looked surprised by the young lady's composure, but quickly led Eleanor through long, dark corridors that felt as cold as a crypt. Under the solemn gaze of ancestral portraits, she followed the housekeeper up a spiral stone staircase, halting before a small wooden door at the summit of the east tower. "This shall be your room," Mrs. Gable said as she pushed the door open. "As the estate is practicing winter economy, the grand chambers have been closed. This room is small but quiet." With that, she lit a single candle on the table and departed, leaving Eleanor alone with her meager trunk. Eleanor surveyed the room, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. This East Tower chamber was ancient, freezing, and long abandoned. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling, the bare wooden floor was rough and without carpet, and the wind whistled through the decaying window frame, causing the candle flame to flicker violently. In the hearth, only a few damp, cold logs sat unlit. On a small wooden table, a meager supper tray had been left, a bowl of cold, congealed potato soup, a hard crust of bread, and a cup of icy water. It was a deliberate insult from Mrs. Gable, a silent warning that Eleanor held no status here at Ravenwood. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window pane. Standing in the freezing room, Eleanor shivered slightly, quickly brushing away a tear before it could fall. She whispered to herself, "Eleanor, you must not weep. You did not come here to be a victim. You must survive and protect your family." Instead of giving in to anger, Eleanor removed her warm cloak and set to work. Finding an old broom in the corner, she swept the cobwebs from the ceiling and cleared the dust from the floor. Using a cloth brought from home, she wiped down the dressing table and the old wooden bed frame, then replaced the stale bed sheets with her own clean, hand-embroidered linen from Hampshire. Within an hour, the room was neat and clean. Eleanor opened her trunk and retrieved a small wooden box carved with lavender, the sole keepsake left by her mother. She placed the box reverently in the center of the dressing table. Looking at it, a wave of warmth washed over her, bolstering her spirit. Her stomach growled, but looking at the cold tray, Eleanor knew she could not stomach it. Rather than sitting in passive misery or summoning a maid, she decided to go down to the kitchens herself to secure warm water and dry wood. Wrapping herself in her woolen cloak and carrying the small candle, she retraced her steps down the dark, spiral staircase to find the basement kitchens. The lively chatter vanished instantly, the moment Eleanor stepped into the cavernous kitchens of Ravenwood. A dozen servants were gathered around the long wooden table beneath the massive hearths. In the center, a plump, maternal woman with a kindly face was busy kneading dough. It was Mrs. Higgins, the cook of the estate. Upon seeing Eleanor enter, the servants rose in a panic, bowing their heads to avoid her gaze. They knew the cold tray had been sent at Mrs. Gable's direction, and feared the young lady had come to vent her anger upon them. Mrs. Higgins paused, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, looking at her with concern. "Miss Eleanor, is there something you require? Was there an issue with your supper?" Eleanor looked around the kitchen, feeling the warmth of the hearth and sensing the apprehension of the poor servants. She offered a gentle smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Higgins and everyone," Eleanor said warmly, stepping closer to the large table. "I apologize if I startled you. I have only come to request some warm water and a few dry logs for the East Tower. The wind is rather fierce up there." Eleanor's respectful demeanor took them all by surprise. Mrs. Higgins let out a breath of relief, her eyes softening at the young lady's resilience. She quickly wiped her hands again. "You poor child. The East Tower is terribly draughty. I shall have the footmen bring up dry wood and hot coals immediately. And as for that cold supper, let me prepare you a hot bowl of onion soup instead, shall I?" "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins." Eleanor agreed with a nod. Her gaze drifted to the table where the lower-tier servants sat, noting their meager supper scraps of dry bread and a thin, watery broth in the midst of a harsh Yorkshire winter. Stirred by compassion, she spoke in a tone both firm and warm. "Mrs. Higgins, the Yorkshire winter is unforgiving, and the manor is cold. The servants work tirelessly. From tomorrow onward, I wish for you to improve the winter rations for all the lower-tier staff. Please add hot meat soup, warm tea, and freshly baked bread to their daily fare so they may have the strength to weather this bitter season." Eleanor's request rang out clearly, leaving the servants stunned and deeply moved. In a place as cold and austere as Ravenwood, no master had ever concerned themselves with the well-being of the lower house. They were usually regarded as nothing more than beasts of burden. Mrs. Higgins looked at Eleanor with profound respect and dipped into a low curtsy. "I understand, my lady. I shall see it done first thing tomorrow. May the Lord bless your kind heart." Eleanor smiled softly as she took the tray with the hot soup and warm water. As she walked away, she knew she had won her very first and crucial allies, the loyalty of the humble servants at the heart of this estate. Ravenwood Manor might be cold, and her betrothed distant, but she vowed to use her quiet strength and compassion to warm this place from within. Chapter 5. The Duquesse's Stewardship. The Yorkshire dawn filtered through the leaded panes of the morning room, casting a warm golden sheen across the polished oak table. Eleanor sat with an unyielding spine upon her blue velvet chair, her fingers idly tapping a quill against the dark wood. The chamber was quiet, save for the dry crackle of the hearth and the distant rustle of oak leaves dancing across the estate. It was her third day at the manor as the Duchess, and she had decided, with quiet resolve, that order must be restored. A soft tap came at the door. Mrs. Gable, the long-serving housekeeper clad in stiff black silk, with a ring of heavy silver keys hanging from her waist, stepped inside. Behind her, 2 footmen labored under the weight of an ebony chest laden with dust-covered, leather-bound ledgers. Mrs. Gable offered a brief, perfunctory nod, the barest politeness reserved for a young duchess she presumed capable of nothing more than embroidery, dancing, and the latest London fashions. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable began, her voice carrying an arctic calm, "I have brought the accounts of the past 3 years as you requested. However, the estate's bookkeeping is rather complex, recorded in the traditional manner. I fear your Grace might find them dry and quite incomprehensible for a lady of your refined upbringing." Eleanor offered a polite, measured smile. "You have my thanks." Mrs. Gable set them down. "If you please, it is precisely that complexity which I seek to unravel." Once the footman retired, Eleanor set to work without delay. She opened the ledger for the kitchen and the stables of the current year. Mrs. Gable remained nearby, her arms crossed in quiet satisfaction. She was entirely confident that the young Duchess would soon surrender to the dizzying columns of figures and archaic terminology. But the housekeeper had sorely misjudged her. In her girlhood, Eleanor had managed her father's impoverished estate with her own hands. Under the dim glow of midnight candles, she had learned to scrutinize every single bill from cunning merchants to keep her family from debtor's prison. Such competence had been forged from the raw survival instincts of the genteel poor. Eleanor's eyes swept swiftly down the pages, her finger pausing at each column as she penciled a firm line beneath the anomalies. The silence in the room grew heavy. Mrs. Gable's smug smile began to falter as she watched the decisive, steady rhythm of Eleanor turning the pages. The Duchess was not merely browsing. She was conducting a thorough investigation. "Mrs. Gable," Eleanor spoke, her tone quiet yet carrying absolute authority. "How do you account for the stable oats in October last being priced 30% higher than the Yorkshire market rate? And why, pray tell, did the kitchen's winter beef consumption double, when the household staff remained unchanged and His Grace was in London. Mrs. Gable stiffened, her color draining slightly before she quickly recovered her poise. Your Grace, the winter was exceptionally harsh, necessitating larger rations to preserve the health of the household. As for the oats, they were of a premium quality, sourced from the south. Premium? Eleanor looked directly at the housekeeper, her gaze piercing. The records state the oats were supplied by Higgins Farm, sharing a surname with our head cook. Yorkshire oats enjoyed a bountiful harvest last year. There was no earthly reason to import them from the south at such exorbitant rates. Furthermore, the transport invoices lack the official seal of the toll gate. Mrs. Gable, summon Chef Higgins here at once, Eleanor commanded. The head cook, Higgins, a portly man with a florid complexion, entered the room alongside Mrs. Gable. He was visibly nervous, yet he maintained the defiant air of a long-standing servant who believed himself irreplaceable. Your Grace. Higgins offered a perfunctory bow. Mrs. Gable informs me that you have inquiries regarding the dinner preparations. Not the dinner, Mr. Higgins, Eleanor replied, slamming the ledger shut with a sharp crack. I wish to speak of the discrepancies in the kitchen accounts. Over the past 6 months, the consumption of butter, sugar, and flour has exceeded the standard limit by nearly 2/5. Furthermore, several substantial payments to the purveyors show no corresponding receipts from the storehouse. Higgins stammered, his voice faltering. Your Grace. A manner of this stature demands the most rigorous standards. We must discard any ingredients of inferior quality. Your Grace cannot possibly comprehend the unavoidable waste in such grand preparations. I understand perfectly what constitutes reasonable waste, Eleanor said, rising from her chair to pace slowly around the oak table. But I will not tolerate waste that finds its way into your pockets and Mrs. Gable's. This is nothing short of theft from the ducal estate. Your Grace, you cannot accuse us so falsely. Mrs. Gable cried, her hands trembling. We have devoted our entire lives to this house. His Grace has never once questioned our loyalty. Eleanor stopped directly before them, her presence so commanding that they both took a step back. I speak from documented proof. If necessary, I shall request Mr. Harrison, the family solicitor, to conduct an independent audit of all transactions under your stewardship. I am certain Mr. Harrison and the Yorkshire courts will find these figures most illuminating. The name Mr. Harrison struck them like a clap of thunder. He was widely known as a man of iron and unyielding severity. Should he intervene, they would not only lose their positions, but their reputations would be utterly ruined, and a prison sentence would surely follow. Mrs. Gable's pride dissolved instantly. Her color drained completely and her knees began to tremble. Beside her, Higgins wiped his brow in sheer terror. Your Grace, I beg of you, Mrs. Gable pleaded. We admit there have been errors in management. We implore your Grace not to summon Mr. Harrison. We shall restore every farthing of the discrepancy. Eleanor watched them tremble. She knew that to dismiss them immediately would plunge the household into chaos. She required their submission, but it must be born of genuine respect. I shall afford you both a single opportunity to redeem yourselves, Eleanor declared, her voice cold as steel. From this day forth, I am restructuring the accounting system. Every invoice must be approved by my hand. Any expenditure exceeding £5 must bear the signatures of at least 3 witnesses. And you, Mr. Higgins, shall present the weekly menus and detailed portion estimates to me every Monday morning. She turned her gaze back to the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable, you shall remain in your post, but if I discover so much as a single suspicious farthing, my letter to Mr. Harrison will be dispatched without hesitation. Do I make myself clear? Yes, I understand, Your Grace, Mrs. Gable murmured, dipping into a deep curtsy, her spirit thoroughly broken. Higgins nodded frantically, not daring to utter a sound. Once they had retreated, Eleanor let out a quiet sigh of relief. The first battle had been won. News of the young Duchess, using her sharp wit to expose the fraud, spread through the manor like wildfire. From the scullery maids to the coachman, everyone began to look upon her with newfound reverence. They realized that beneath her gentle demeanor lay an iron will and a razor-sharp intellect. Yet reformation did not signify heartless austerity. Eleanor implemented her new system by bypassing unnecessary middlemen, negotiating directly with reputable merchants to secure the best rates. Consequently, the operational costs of the estate decreased significantly, saving the family fortune a handsome sum. Nevertheless, Eleanor did not neglect the welfare of the servants. She ensured their food was fresh, their quarters sufficiently warm for the winter, and their wages paid promptly. As she remarked to Mrs. Gable, "We achieve economy through intelligent management, not by grinding down the livelihood of those who serve us." This combination of benevolence and firm discipline won the hearts of the household. The manor ran more smoothly than ever, the tense atmosphere dissipated, replaced by an unyielding loyalty to their new duchess, who had proven beyond a doubt that she was entirely worthy of her station. Chapter 6. Leo, the orphan boy. Ravenwood Manor, in the dying days of winter, still held a melancholy beauty, a bleakness native to the wild Yorkshire moors. The northern light faded rapidly, yielding to thick, rolling mists that coiled around the ancient, gray stone turrets. The wind howled through the stone crevices, carrying the bone-chilling cold of the damp marshland, and rattled incessantly against the towering leaded windows. Yet inside the manor, the presence of Eleanor Vance had wrought subtle, unseen changes. The faded carpets had been carefully cleaned, fresh sprigs of purple heather sat neatly upon the fireplace mantels, and the hearth in the grand library was kept constantly, warmly alight. Amidst this brooding castle, there was one soul who occupied Eleanor's thoughts above all else. This was Leo, the 6-year-old orphan nephew of Arthur Pendleton. Ever since the carriage accident that had claimed his parents a year ago, Leo had retreated into a world of absolute silence. Not a single word, not a whisper of a sound passed his lips. He was like a wounded creature, constantly trembling and deeply wary of everyone around him. Every day, Eleanor would catch sight of Leo, slipping behind the white marble statues that lined the grand corridor. The boy's large, round eyes, filled with profound fear, would watch her every step intently. Whenever Eleanor turned and offered a gentle smile, Leo would startle immediately, vanishing into the shadows like a ghost. Eleanor understood that, for a deeply wounded child, coercion would only inflict more pain upon his fragile heart. She did not pursue him, she did not call out, nor did she force him to face her. Instead, she chose to respect Leo's safe distance, patiently waiting for the icy walls of his defense to melt away. On a Wednesday afternoon, as weak shafts of sunlight filtered through the arched library windows, Eleanor decided to sit and sketch by the windowsill, looking out over the snow-covered gardens. Upon the table, she placed her small, wooden wax crayon box, the most precious keepsake from her late mother. The dark cedarwood box, carved with delicate lavender sprigs, always exuded a gentle scent of beeswax and ancient pine, summoning warm childhood memories of when her mother used to teach her how to draw. She opened the cedarwood lid, revealing the vibrant colors neatly arranged inside, and began placing her first pencil sketches onto the thick parchment. She was well aware that Leo was hiding behind the marble statue of Diana in the corner of the room, peering through the gap between the antique bookshelves. Eleanor did not turn around, she merely began to hum, very softly, a tender Yorkshire folk song her mother had once sung to lull her to sleep, her clear voice flowing like a warm stream through the silent library. She began to draw a small squirrel with a bushy tail, bounding along the branch of an old oak tree. Elegant, lively strokes quickly emerged upon the page. She shaded the squirrel's fur with warm brown, then sketched golden-orange acorns scattered around it. The sweet scent of beeswax filled the air. Slowly, the child's curiosity began to triumph over his fear. Eleanor caught the sound of extremely light, hesitant footsteps drawing near. She maintained the rhythm of her sketching, refusing to turn her head lest she startle the boy. Leo stepped slowly out from the shadow of the statue. He advanced inch by inch, his eyes locked onto the vivid drawing before shifting to the open crayon box. When he was only 3 paces away, Leo paused, his breath coming in shallow, tense breaths. He stared intently at a bright green wax crayon nestled in the corner of the box. Eleanor smiled softly, her voice as gentle as a passing breeze. "This little squirrel needs some green leaves to shield him from the rain, Leo. But my hands are quite occupied with drawing the branches. Would you help me color the leaves?" She kept her eyes on the paper, her right hand sketching lightly, while her left hand gently nudged the crayon box forward, just enough for the boy to reach. Leo stood in silence for several minutes, looking at Eleanor, then back at the crayon. His small hand trembled slightly. He hesitated, reaching out timidly, only to pull back again. Yet, drawn by her gentle warmth, Leo summoned his courage, stepped forward, and snatched the green crayon before retreating a few paces, as though expecting a scolding. Eleanor turned to look at him, her gray eyes filled with encouragement. "Thank you. Now shall we make this forest green together?" She pointed to the outlined shape of several oak leaves. Leo blinked, then slowly approached the windowsill. He pressed the crayon to the paper and began to color. Though his strokes were clumsy and strayed outside the lines, Eleanor remained patiently by his side, whispering sweet words of praise. As the days went by, a silent routine established itself between them. Every afternoon, once Eleanor finished her ledger work, she would sit by the window, and Leo would already be waiting there, slipping onto the small footstool beside her without hiding anymore. Together they created vibrant drawings. Eleanor would sketch the wild creatures, and Leo would color them. One afternoon, she outlined a magnificent silver wolf, standing proudly atop a rocky ridge under the moonlight. "This is the crest of your house, Leo," Eleanor murmured, guiding his tiny fingers as they held the silver-gray crayon to shade the wolf. "It looks fierce and cold, much like your Uncle Arthur. But the silver wolf is only cold to outsiders. To its family it is the most loyal protector, forever guarding the hearth through the coldest winter nights." Her warm voice mingled with the soft scrape of the crayon on parchment. Leo listened intently, his eyes shining as though he could see the silver wolf stepping right out of the tale. Eleanor told him of the legends of the wild Yorkshire forests, of brave falcons, of tiny hares hiding beneath the purple heather, and of the resilience of all living things in the face of winter's frost. The boy hung on her every word, the distance between them completely vanishing. At times Leo would unconsciously drift closer, leaning his small shoulder against Eleanor's arm for warmth. She gently stroked his soft silken hair, her touch as tender as a mother's. Late one afternoon, as a crimson sunset painted the Yorkshire sky, Arthur Pendleton returned to the manor after a long, exhausting day surveying the tenant farms. His black riding coat was still dusted with road grime and the chill of the winter wind. As he passed the darkened corridor outside the library, Arthur came to a sudden halt. The door stood slightly ajar, allowing the warm glow of the hearth fire and the fading sunset to spill out, cutting a path through the shadows of the hallway. Arthur stood in silence, observing the scene within. Beneath the ancient arched window, Eleanor and Leo sat side by side on a soft velvet cushion. The gentle sunset illuminated the delicate profile of Eleanor's face, highlighting her fair skin and chestnut-brown hair. She was leaning forward, her left arm draped over Leo's shoulders, her right hand gently guiding his tiny fingers to draw the silver wolf. "Look, Leo," Eleanor whispered, "our silver wolf has a warm home now. He no longer has to stand alone in the wind and snow." Leo looked up at her, and then the boy's small lips curved, parting into a radiant, innocent smile of absolute trust. Standing in the cold corridor, Arthur felt a sudden tightness seize his chest. An intense emotion, both aching and warm, surged through the breast of the Duke, a man renowned for his icy reserve and hardened nature. His heart, long locked away by the trauma of Waterloo and the bitter grief of losing his kin, now felt a gentle warmth thawing its icy edges. He looked at Eleanor, the lady cast out by society, whom he had taken in solely out of a pragmatic marriage settlement, using her infinite patience and love to heal his wounded nephew. She made no grand displays, she simply quietly brought warmth and life to his dark manor. Arthur's hand clenched into a fist, suppressing the wave of emotion swelling in his chest. A strange, sweet sentiment was beginning to take root in his soul. He realized that Eleanor Vance's presence at Ravenwood Manor was no longer a mere obligation or a cold marriage settlement. She had become woven into the fabric of his life. Arthur stood quietly in the shadows, gazing at Leo's smile and Eleanor's tender eyes, before silently turning away, carrying within his heart a new, fragile hope born amidst the bleak Yorkshire winter. Chapter 7: Emergence of Warmth. The Yorkshire winter descended with a vengeance, howling snowstorms lashing against the stone facade of Ravenwood Manor. Inside, however, time seemed to slow under the soft glow of candlelight and the meager warmth offered by the ancient hearth. Dinner in the great dining room was a remarkably quiet affair. At either end of the vast oak table sat its only occupants. Arthur, his imposing figure partially veiled in the shadows, occupied the head of the table. Eleanor sat directly opposite him, looking utterly elegant in a simple gown of moss-green silk. Only sounds in the room were the crackling of firewood and the faint clink of silverware. Between them, however, an invisible thread of connection stretched taut, pulsing with every breath they drew. Arthur raised his glass of claret, his gaze drifting stealthily toward Eleanor through the flickering candlelight. She dined with composed grace, her movements refined, showing none of the trepidation or fear that the ladies of the London ton so often displayed in his presence. Since the day Eleanor had set foot in the manor, Ravenwood had undergone a strange transformation. She had brought order to the chaotic account books, won the quiet respect of the servants, and brought a genuine smile back to his nephew Leo's face. She was like a beam of warm light, slowly melting the frost that had encased this stone fortress for years. Sensing his gaze, Eleanor lifted her head slightly. Their eyes met across the candlelight, initiating a silent dialogue of understanding between two kindred souls. Eleanor noted the deep exhaustion etched upon her husband's features. The jagged scar along his left cheek appeared more inflamed than usual, and his broad shoulders were stiff beneath his dark coat. She knew his old war wound was acting up, throbbing with intense pain as the Yorkshire chill set in, yet his fierce pride would never allow him to show vulnerability before anyone. She offered him a gentle, understanding smile. Arthur felt a tightening in his chest, hastily lowering his glass and looking away to preserve his cold mask. As dinner concluded and Arthur bowed to retire to his study, she observed his heavy footsteps, his left hand instinctively pressed against his side to dull the pain. Late that night, the snowstorm howled outside. Eleanor lay in her bed in the East Tower, unable to sleep, her mind filled with images of Arthur suffering in silence. She understood all too well what it meant to endure pain alone during those long years in the drafty attic room of Vance Manor. She had been forced to bind her own emotional wounds with no one to share her burden. Slipping on a gray cloak, she carried a candle down to the basement kitchen. After coaxing the embers to boil water, she selected chamomile, mint, and ginger from her mother's wooden keepsake box to brew a hot infusion. She also prepared a linen compress, soaking it in warm water before wringing it dry and placing it on the tray beside the teapot. Carrying the tea tray to Arthur's study in the west wing, she noticed a faint sliver of light beneath the door and knocked softly. Receiving no answer, she spoke in a quiet voice. "Your Grace, it is Eleanor. I have brought some hot tea for you." A raspy, exhausted voice called out from within. "Enter." The study, crowded with ancient volumes, was illuminated only by the dim amber glow of a single oil lamp. Arthur sat beside a cold fireplace, clad only in a thin white linen shirt. His right hand was gripped tightly over his left shoulder, where the jagged, uneven scar of Waterloo lay. Perspiration beaded on his brow as he gritted his teeth against the agony. A half-emptied glass of brandy stood nearby, proof of his attempt to drown the pain in spirits, though it had only left his eyes bloodshot and weary. Arthur straightened himself immediately, attempting to shield the scar as he reassumed his cold demeanor. "Duchess, it is far too late for you to be wandering the halls. You should not have come." Eleanor set the tray down upon the desk and knelt beside his armchair, looking directly into his eyes. "I could not sleep knowing you were enduring such pain alone. Please, let me help soothe the tension in your shoulders." Arthur flinched, his shoulder tensing as a fresh wave of pain washed over him. "There is no need, Eleanor. No remedy can cure this old Waterloo wound. I have grown accustomed to bearing it alone for many years." "Return to your chambers. You may have borne it alone for many years, Arthur," Eleanor replied softly, using his Christian name instead of his formal title. Her ash-gray eyes shone with earnest sincerity. "But you are no longer solitary. We are husband and wife before the law let me care for you." Her quiet words chipped away at Arthur's long-held stubbornness. In her gaze, there was none of the feigned pity or revulsion the London high society usually reserved for his disfigurement, only a deep, sincere concern. Slowly, Arthur lowered his hand, allowing his tense shoulders to relax. Eleanor gently applied the warm herb-infused compress to his left shoulder. As the soothing heat penetrated his skin, Arthur let out a long, ragged sigh of relief, closing his eyes and leaning his head back against the armchair. Her small, delicate hands deftly pressed the cloth, sending a healing warmth through his chilled frame. "Drink some of this chamomile and ginger tea. It will help soothe your spirits," Eleanor said, pouring the amber liquid into a porcelain cup. Arthur took it from her, sipping the hot brew. The subtle sweetness mingled with the sharp heat of the ginger, and combined with the warmth of the compress, began to dispel the biting cold. "Thank you," Arthur murmured, his voice low. "A winter night such as this brings back the darkest days of my life." Eleanor pulled a chair closer to sit beside him, listening in quiet comfort. "At Waterloo," Arthur began, his eyes fixed on the flickering oil lamp. "The night before the battle was bitterly cold and rainy, and then the hell of artillery opened up. When I was shot and fell into the mud, I truly believed I would die there, entirely alone. I survived, but only to bear this scar. Upon my return to London, the Tun looked upon me as a monster, and the ladies shunned me, so I retreated to Ravenwood, cloistered in my own solitude." A deep ache of sympathy stirred within Eleanor's chest. She placed her hand over his. "They were not worthy of you, Arthur. This scar is the badge of a courageous hero. not the mark of a monster. It is a part of the resilient man I have come to esteem. Arthur stilled, then turned his palm upward to clasp her hand firmly in his. For the first time in years, someone truly understood his pain. "And what of you?" Arthur asked softly. "From whence did you draw such fortitude?" Eleanor lowered her head, a shadow of past sorrow crossing her face. "My resilience was forged in solitude, Arthur. After my mother passed, Vance Manor became a place of dark, endless trials. My father was too weak-willed to prevent my stepmother and Clara from banishing me to a freezing attic room. I was left to manage the estate accounts alone, struggling to keep us afloat while my father squandered our remaining wealth at the hazard tables. The small wooden box containing my mother's keepsakes was the only thing that preserved my dignity under the cold glow of a single candle. I swore I would never let them break my spirit." Arthur squeezed her hand, filled with a profound reverence for the slender woman who had withstood such cruelty. Two scarred souls had finally found solace in each other at Ravenwood. "We have both known bitter winters," Arthur murmured, his eyes shining with a warmth that was entirely new. "But tonight I feel a true warmth." Eleanor smiled. In the stillness of the study, the chasm between the formidable Duke and his debt-bound bride dissolved. Amidst the freezing Yorkshire winter, a quiet understanding was kindling a flame of affection, slowly melting the ice that had bound their lives for so long. Chapter 8. Sheltering the tenants. A brutal blizzard from the north swept across the wild Yorkshire valley. The wind howled through the stone crevices of Ravenwood Castle, lashing white snow against the high, arched windows. Inside, though the hearths burned red, the chill still seeped through the gray stone corridors. Eleanor Vance stood by the library window, wrapping her warm woolen cloak tightly around her shoulders as she gazed out at the blinding snow swallowing the distant hills. Since becoming the Duchess, she had spent hours reviewing the estate ledgers, only to discover that the former housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had neglected the repairs of the southern tenants' cottages to line her own pockets. Knowing those rotting thatched roofs could never withstand a blizzard, Eleanor had intended to propose repairs to Arthur, but the storm had descended before she could speak. Her fears were realized when Mr. Harrison, the estate land agent, entered the room, his face pale with cold and mounting anxiety. "Your Grace," Harrison spoke, his voice trembling. "The snowslide in the south has collapsed the roofs of 5 households. Many others are in a state of severe disrepair, leaving the elderly and young children to huddle under tattered canvas, amidst the driving snow. The situation is far worse than we had anticipated." Eleanor asked immediately, "Has the Duke not yet returned from York?" "Your Grace, His Grace rode to York on urgent business," Harrison replied, wringing his hands. "The deep snow has blocked the roads, preventing the horses from traveling swiftly. It will be at least 2 days before he returns. I fear we must wait for his signed warrant to release the funds, as the Treasury clerk refuses to disburse a single penny without it." 2 days, Eleanor cut in, her voice ringing with determination. "By then they will have frozen. We cannot allow human lives to be held hostage by mere bureaucracy. I shall take the responsibility." She opened a drawer and retrieved an ebony box containing £500 of pin money, the personal allowance Arthur had settled upon her at their marriage. She recalled his words, "This is your own money, Eleanor. You have sole authority over it, without the need to consult anyone. In London, such a sum would merely purchase a few extravagant ball gowns, but here in impoverished Yorkshire it was a fortune capable of buying materials to save 100 souls. I shall employ this money," Eleanor declared, placing the banknotes upon the desk. "Mr. Harrison, take this to purchase oak timber and dry thatch immediately. Hire the finest carpenters to rebuild the tenants' homes without delay. Ravenwood shall pay double wages to any man willing to work in this weather." Harrison gasped in astonishment. "But Your Grace, this is your private pin money. His Grace would surely not wish." "Money has value only when it preserves human life," Eleanor replied, her tone brooking no argument. "In the Duke's absence, it is my duty to protect his people. Go at once, Mr. Harrison. I will not have anyone perish from the cold on this estate." Once Harrison departed, Eleanor commanded the kitchens to prepare large cauldrons of hot meat broth, while she gathered warm blankets and old woolen coats to be loaded onto the carriage. She was resolved to go to the scene herself, refusing to remain warm and idle within the castle walls. The carriage set off into the howling blizzard. Eleanor wore a simple gray cloak, wrapping a thick scarf to cover her golden hair, ignoring the protests of the servants. She understood that a true duchess must stand with her people when the storm descended. At the southern hillside, the scene was pitiable. Snow mixed with soil to form a filthy, freezing mire. The collapsed roofs exposed the freezing interiors, and ragged tenants huddled beneath oak trees, clutching their shivering children to shield them from the wind. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking into the freezing mud. Together with the servants, she carried the hot broth to the few intact porches, ladling it out herself into trembling hands. Her gentleness left them speechless. The high-born lady, accustomed to the finest silks, now stood in the mud, her skirts soiled, yet her smile remained warm and full of grace. Thanks to her funds, timber and thatch arrived swiftly. Teams of laborers worked urgently to raise the house frames under Harrison's direction. Eleanor's presence provided immense encouragement. The rugged Yorkshireman, who had long distrusted the London aristocracy, now looked upon her with deep reverence, working tirelessly despite the biting snow stinging their faces. She visited the dilapidated village schoolhouse at the crossroads. Seeing the freezing classroom and the impoverished schoolmaster, Mr. Benson, desperately trying to salvage waterlogged books, Eleanor said softly, "Mr. Benson, I shall fund the repairs of the school and order 100 new volumes. Starting this month, Ravenwood shall provide you an annual stipend of £20, so you may teach without financial worry." Mr. Benson's eyes filled with tears. "God bless you, Your Grace, you are an angel sent to deliver this valley." Meanwhile, upon the snow-covered road leading to Ravenwood, Arthur Pendleton was riding furiously. Upon hearing reports of the blizzard ravaging the estate, his thoughts turned solely to Eleanor, the wife he had wed to save her honor, but who had now claimed a deep, irreplaceable place in his heart. Disregarding the peril, Arthur rode through the night. He blamed himself for not being present sooner, fearing that Eleanor, accustomed to southern luxury, would panic in the face of such a harsh northern winter. As he rode into the southern village, Arthur pulled his reins, stunned. Instead of chaos and ruin, he beheld a bustling construction site amidst the falling snow. The sound of hammers echoed beside roaring bonfires, and in the midst of the crowd he saw her. Eleanor, dressed in a dark woolen cloak soiled with mud, was kneeling on the sodden earth, holding a frightened 5-year-old girl close to her chest. She wrapped her own warm woolen scarf around the child's shoulders, stroking her hair and murmuring gentle comforts. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hands red with cold, yet her eyes shone with a pure, saintly light. She was using her own warmth to comfort the child. Arthur stood frozen, transfixed by the sight. The proud heart of the Waterloo veteran swelled with a profound, aching warmth. The London débutantes knew only frivolous balls and haughty pretense. Even his late wife had never set foot in this impoverished village. Yet Eleanor stood here, bringing hope to the poor with her own hands and generous spirit. She was the true, most deserving Duchess of Ravenwood. Arthur dismounted, striding through the mud to her side. Eleanor looked up, catching sight of his snow-covered face. "Arthur, you have returned?" She attempted to rise, but her knees, stiff from kneeling in the freezing mud, trembled. Arthur caught her waist, lifting her steadily to her feet. His warm hands cupped her face, gently wiping away a smudge of mud. The gaze he fixed upon her was filled with an unprecedented tenderness. "Why are you out here in such dreadful weather?" he murmured, his voice thick with concern. Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. "Because they need me, Arthur. They are your people, and thus they are my family. I have spent my pin money to help rebuild their homes. I only hope you do not think me too presumptuous." Arthur stared at her in silence, his icy blue eyes melting with a sudden, fierce affection. He unclasped his heavy black wool greatcoat, draped it over her shoulders, and drew her close against his chest before the entire assembly. "Think you presumptuous?" Arthur whispered. "I must thank you, Eleanor. You have warmed this frozen land and my own heart as well. You are the only Duchess Ravenwood shall ever have. From this day forth, your word on this estate is my command." Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart and absorbing the heat of his embrace. For the first time, she felt that Ravenwood was truly the home where she belonged. The surrounding tenants bowed their heads in silent reverence to their Duke and Duchess. They knew that under Eleanor's guidance, their lives would begin a new, warmer chapter. Chapter 9. The Yorkshire Winter Dinner. The grand hall of Ravenwood Manor glowed beneath the warmth of 100 beeswax candles, casting long shadows against ancient stone walls and rich, woven tapestries. Upon the long, dark oak dining table, silver candelabras reflected brilliantly in the cut crystal and fine porcelain. The soft, elegant strains of the harp and violin drifted through the air, mingling with the polite whispers and hushed laughter of the assembled gentry. It was the grandest banquet hosted at Ravenwood, in over a decade, meticulously arranged by Arthur to present Eleanor, his newly wedded wife, as the rightful Duchess of Yorkshire. Eleanor stood beside Arthur at the entrance, her hand resting lightly upon his arm. She wore an evening gown of emerald green satin, which complemented the delicate slope of her shoulders and her fair complexion. Her dark hair was swept up in a noble coiffure, leaving a few soft curls to frame her delicate face. The heirloom emerald necklace Arthur had gifted her shone brilliantly under the candlelight, a striking testament to her new station. Yet, though Eleanor strove to maintain an air of poise and confidence, Arthur could still feel the faint, telltale trembling of her fingertips against his sleeve. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a low murmur meant only for her ears. "You are doing splendidly. Eleanor, hold your gaze high. You are the Duchess of Ravenwood, and not a soul in this room has the right to question it." Eleanor looked up, meeting his deep gray eyes usually so cold, but now filled with a quiet, reassuring warmth. She gave a slight nod, drawing a steadying breath to compose herself. "Thank you, Arthur. It is only, I have not stood before so many scrutinizing eyes since the ruin in London." "This is not London," Arthur replied, his dark gaze sweeping over the room. "This is Yorkshire, my domain, and everyone here shall bow to you." The Yorkshire gentry, known for their pride and deep suspicion of Southerners, were soon disarmed by Eleanor's grace and refined manners. She conversed with Lady Danbury regarding charitable endeavors and discussed new agricultural methods with Lord Melton. Her intellect and genuine warmth conquered even the most critical guests. Arthur stood by her side, offering occasional sharp, incisive remarks, but for the most part, he simply observed her in silence, a quiet pride and a rare warmth creeping into his guarded heart. The dinner proceeded flawlessly, with exquisite courses and wine poured continuously. The pleasant clinking of crystal glasses harmonized with the lively chatter. Eleanor felt the heavy burden on her chest begin to lift. She looked at Arthur, the man rumored to be a ruthless beast, now politely raising his glass to the local lords to secure her place among them. A sweet, unfamiliar emotion began to bloom in her heart. But this serenity was not to last. As the dinner progressed to the dessert, the grand oak doors were suddenly thrown open with a violent crash. The abrupt commotion caused the violins to fall silent, and every eye in the room turned toward the entrance. Thomas Thorne and Clara barged in, looking thoroughly disheveled despite their attempts at donning fine attire. Ever since Arthur had frozen their assets following their betrayal, they had sunk into absolute ruin, pursued relentlessly by creditors. Fleeing to Yorkshire in hopes of begging for mercy, or resorting to blackmail, their bitter resentment upon learning that Arthur was hosting a grand dinner to honor Eleanor had driven them to force their way into Ravenwood Manor. Thomas Thorne stepped forward, his face gaunt and his eyes bloodshot with drink. Beside him, Clara clung to his arm, her hair untidy beneath a battered bonnet, her eyes burning with pure malice as she stared at Eleanor's magnificent gown. Oh, what a splendid spectacle! Thomas sneered, staggering toward the high table. The Duke of Ravenwood hosts a banquet to present his beloved wife? What a touching performance. Arthur rose, his towering frame radiating a suffocating, menacing presence. "Thomas, how dare you show your face here? And why ever not?" Thomas laughed with desperate bravado, pointing a finger at Eleanor, whose face had gone pale. "I came to ensure the Yorkshire gentry know exactly whom they are raising their glasses to." Clara stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom. "That woman is Eleanor Thorne, a creature jilted at the very altar by her former betrothed due to her family's debts. She is nothing but a commodity, selling herself to the beast to spare her father from a debtor's prison." Clara's words cut like daggers into Eleanor's heart. The agonizing memory of the day she was abandoned, the mocking glances and the cruel whispers of the London ton rushed back, suffocating her. Beneath the table, Eleanor's fingers clenched into a tight fist, her lips trembling as all color drained from her face. A murmur rippled through the assembly. The local gentry began to whisper, dissecting the sordid details of the jilted bride's debts, murmuring that the Duke of Ravenwood marrying such a woman was a grave stain upon his noble house. Sensing the crowd's shifting mood, Thomas grew bolder, his voice hardening. Arthur did not wed her out of affection. It is nothing but a sordid transaction. Arthur required an heir and a screen for his scarred face, while Eleanor needed gold to rescue her family from prison. It is a marriage of convenience and mutual exploitation. The public humiliation made the ground feel as though it were collapsing beneath Eleanor's feet. She wished to stand and defend herself, but her throat caught. The ghosts of her past choked her, leaving her feeling utterly defenseless before the harsh judgment of the crowd. At that very moment, a large, warm hand slipped beneath the table, firmly clasping her trembling fingers. Eleanor looked up in astonishment. Arthur was gazing down at her with an unwavering look, filled with absolute protection and resolute trust. The warmth of his touch seeped into her skin, serving as a solid anchor that held her steady in the eye of the storm. Arthur released her hand and turned to face the two intruders. His voice, low yet carrying the force of thunder, instantly silenced the rising murmurs. Enough. He stepped away from the high table, advancing directly toward the intruders. The sheer authority and cold anger radiating from him made Thomas instinctively recoil, his bravado vanishing, replaced by a primal fear of the notoriously ruthless Duke. "You dare speak of betrayal, Thomas?" Arthur let out a glacial laugh. "It was you and Clara who embezzled the funds, defrauding Eleanor's family. Now that your assets are rightfully frozen, you scurry about like sewer rats. You have no right to stand in this hall, and you certainly have no right to utter my Duchess's name." Arthur turned his gaze back to the assembled lords and ladies, his eyes sharp as flint sweeping over them, forcing those who had been whispering to lower their heads in shame. Eleanor did not sell herself. She was the only one brave and genuine enough to enter Ravenwood. "Our marriage requires no validation from any of you. She is my Duchess, the sole mistress of this estate. Anyone who dares to insult her insults me, and shall answer to me." Arthur's fierce declaration instantly silenced all judgment. His public defense of Eleanor stood as the ultimate testament to her unassailable station. Arthur signaled to the footmen waiting at the edges of the room. "Remove them from Ravenwood, and summon the magistrate. Have them arrested for fraud and debt evasion." The footmen immediately seized Thomas and Clara. Thomas thrashed, shouting hoarsely, "Arthur, you cannot treat your own cousin in this manner. Eleanor, you will rue the day." Clara wept hysterically as she was dragged away. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, returning the ballroom to a stunned, heavy silence. Arthur turned back, walking directly to Eleanor. Before the entire assembly he bowed, lifting her hand to place a reverent, tender kiss upon her knuckles. "Are you unharmed, Eleanor?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, born of sheer emotion. Looking at the man who had defended her so unconditionally, she lightly pressed his fingers, offering a soft smile. "I am quite well, Arthur. With you by my side, I fear nothing." Lord Danbury raised his crystal goblet high. "To the Duchess of Ravenwood. To the peace of Yorkshire." The assembly immediately echoed the sentiment, their voices rising in a roaring toast that filled the hall as the music resumed its lively tempo. The storm had passed, and Eleanor's position at Ravenwood was now more secure than ever, shielded by the fierce protection and unconditional love of her Duke. Chapter 10. The Supreme Acknowledgment. The atmosphere within the grand ballroom of Ravenwood Castle grew suddenly heavy, so taut that the mere clink of crystal glasses was enough to make one start. Under the light of the colossal chandelier, Eleanor stood alone, the hem of her pale blue silk gown stirring slightly. Standing opposite her was Clara Thorne in a deep crimson velvet gown, her face contorted with jealousy, and Thomas Thorne, the decadent nobleman, wearing a triumphant sneer. They had chosen the very height of the gathering, when the room was most crowded, to corner her. "Look at her," Clara projected her voice, ensuring it reached every guest in the assembly. The daughter of a penniless scholar from some remote province, no more than a governess hired to care for the mute Ravenwood child. Yet she dares to stand here in the guise of our future Duchess? It is an absolute insult to the peerage. Thomas stepped forward, sneering at Eleanor from head to toe. Indeed, Eleanor Vance is nothing but a calculating impostor. She has employed the most duplicitous wiles to seduce His Grace Duke Arthur, exploiting the innocence of poor little Leo to infiltrate this castle in pursuit of wealth. A woman of no lineage, no title, and without a single penny of dowry. How could she possibly be fit to stand beside the Duke? Whispers rose like an undercurrent through the crowd, and judgmental glances descended upon Eleanor from all sides. Clenching her hands beneath the folds of her silk gown, Eleanor felt the sting of public humiliation, yet her pride would not allow her to falter. She held her head high, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. "I have nothing to prove to you, Mr. Thorne. My affection for Leo is genuine. Your malicious slander only exposes the utter wretchedness of your own character." Thomas snarled, his face flushing crimson with rage. He raised his hand, pointing directly at her face. Before he could strike, the sound of small, hurried footsteps echoed from the grand gallery, shattering the tense atmosphere. It was Leo. Dressed in an elegant black velvet suit, the young boy ran swiftly through the crowd of aristocrats, who parted in astonishment. Leo rushed forward, his small hands clutching the silk skirts of Eleanor's gown, standing defensively before her like a miniature knight. He looked up, glaring directly at Thomas and Clara, took a deep breath, and spoke in a childish yet resolute voice that rang clearly through the hall. "She is my mother, do not speak ill of my mother." The ballroom fell into a stunned absolute silence. A year had passed since the death of Leo's mother, and the child had retreated into total muteness, leaving the finest physicians to shake their heads in helplessness. Yet now he had spoken to defend Eleanor, calling her my mother. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. She knelt, drawing Leo's small shoulders into a tight embrace, her voice trembling. "Leo, you are speaking, my darling child," the boy whispered back. "Mother, I am well. I will protect you." Clara Thorne's color drained, her voice faltering as she stammered, "No, this cannot be. The child is mute." At that precise moment, Mrs. Higgins, the long-serving housekeeper of Ravenwood Castle, entered the ballroom alongside the stern butler, Mr. Gable, followed by a long line of the estate's domestic staff. Silently but resolutely, they marched forward, forming a formidable and solemn wall of support directly behind Eleanor and Leo, a silent testament to their absolute loyalty. Mrs. Higgins dipped into a respectful curtsy before Eleanor, then turned to Thomas and Clara with a chilling gaze. "Ravenwood Castle may extend its hospitality to guests, but we shall never tolerate those who insult our future Duchess. Since the days Miss Eleanor set foot in this house, she has restored life to the estate and healed young Master Leo. To us, she has long been the sole mistress of Ravenwood." Mr. Gable, the butler, struck his staff firmly against the oak floor. "The loyalty of the House of Ravenwood belongs to Eleanor Vance. Anyone who insults her declares war upon the castle itself." Thomas Thorne burst into a harsh laugh, attempting to conceal his mounting panic. "Absurd. What right have mere servants to speak? Where is the Duke? Where is Arthur?" "Thomas Thorne," a voice as cold as winter frost echoed from the grand staircase. The crowd of guests parted instantly. Arthur Vance, the Duke of Ravenwood, was descending step by step. Dressed in an elegant black suit with a fur-trimmed velvet cloak draped carelessly over his shoulders, his face was as expressionless as carved marble, his deep gray eyes radiating a suffocating authority. Thomas trembled, yet he clung to a desperate shred of hope. "Arthur, you arrive at the perfect moment. See how this provincial woman disrupts your household." But before Thomas could even extend his pointing finger, Arthur crossed the distance with terrifying speed. His hand, cold and unyielding as steel, clamped around Thomas's wrist, squeezing with a crushing force that made the joints click audibly. Grimacing in agony, Thomas fell to his knees upon the floor. Arthur stared directly into Thomas's terrified eyes, his deep voice carrying through the entire hall. "She has no need to prove her standing to anyone here, for from this day forth her standing is myself." The absolute declaration struck the hall like a thunderbolt. Any lingering doubts or contempt from the aristocratic guests were instantly extinguished. The most powerful duke in the realm had publicly and officially bound his own honor and authority to this woman. Arthur released his grip, casting Thomas onto the floor. Leisurely, he drew a black leather document roll, secured with the red wax seal of the High Court, from his breast pocket, casting it down before Thomas. "Did you truly believe your financial deceptions, crooked gambling, and massive debts at the London gaming dens could be hidden from me? Thomas, this is the official writ of seizure from the High Court. From this day forward, the entirety of the Thorne estate and all your ancestral lands are confiscated and transferred to the House of Ravenwood to settle the gaming debts you signed." With trembling fingers, Thomas unrolled the document, his face draining of all color until it was utterly ashen. He mumbled in despair, "No, it cannot be. The Thorne estate, my ancestral inheritance. It is entirely over for you," Arthur said, his voice flat and final. "You and your sister no longer hold title to a single blade of grass on this land." Upon hearing this, Clara Thorne collapsed entirely, burying her face in her hands as she wept in bitter humiliation. Thomas looked up at Arthur, then at Eleanor standing proud and unbowed. He knew he was utterly defeated. Under the weight of Arthur's icy glare, Thomas sank onto his knees before Eleanor, bowing his head low to utter the humiliating admission, "I bow before you." "Your Grace," the formal submission from the mouth of their enemy, brought an end to all dispute. Arthur gave a brief nod. Mr. Gable instantly ordered the footman to step forward, escorting Thomas and Clara Thorne from the ballroom and expelling them from Ravenwood Castle amidst the contemptuous whispers of the guests. Arthur turned back to Eleanor. The frost on his features vanished entirely, replaced by a gaze of infinite warmth and tenderness. Bending down, he lifted young Leo with one arm, while his other hand clasped Eleanor's soft yet resilient fingers. "The storm has passed, my Eleanor," Arthur spoke softly. "From this day forth, no one shall ever harm you or our son again." Eleanor smiled, her tears of happiness catching the light. She squeezed his calloused, warm hand, gazing at Leo, who was beaming with joy. Outside, the gray winter clouds of London had completely dispersed, giving way to a flawless sky. The first warm beams of early spring began to pierce through the stained glass windows of Ravenwood Castle, casting brilliant golden light across the vast hall. The ancient castle, which had languished in darkness and cold for a full year, was now bathed in the warm light of love, healing, and renewed hope. Holding hands, the small family of 3 walked forward, toward a bright future and the complete happiness that awaited them.